police department represents approximately 27% of the overall city budget, but that takes into account all the special funded departments. It's more accurate to say it's approximately 50% of the general fund budget.
So it's 50% of the general funds. And when we speak about these efficiencies, and we take a step back, how much less in position on the general fund will we have as a result of these measures?
Just throwing out numbers, if we were to stop sworn hiring, as Councilman Parks had remarked earlier, we would have trimmed out approximately 100 officers between now and the end of the fiscal year. If we were not to build those 100 officers into the base budget for the department next year, that would save the city approximately $15 million.
$50 million?
15, 1-5.
1-5. And so, but the overall percentage of what is spent on police does not go down very far.
The sworn salaries will probably represent somewhere between $930 million to $940 million next year. So it would be a reduction of 1 to 2% of their overall budget.
About 2%. So in the context of this bigger discussion, we see the planning department disappearing by almost 40%. And you go down the list, recreation, parks, and housing. How do these measures begin to answer the question, what kind of city will we be in the future? And then that's a question that I'm having a hard time answering. And when interest groups and folks speak to me and say, you know, what kind of city are we? And I keep pointing to the proverbial big stick. Are we going to be just a law enforcement city, or are we going to have other services? My question to you is,
you don't want to answer.
How do we start answering that question? I need to put that on the table because your answers need to, I think, begin to address that image and that definition of what type of city will we be. And I put that on the table to you. If anyone can answer, I would appreciate it.
Well, I'll give it a shot. You know, we're looking at approximately $200 million shortfall now. Today.
200 million.
We have about $485 million projected for next year. So within the context of just looking at LAPD hiring, $15 million savings for next year means that we get $15 million closer to that, addressing that $485 million shortfall for next year. It means getting roughly $2 to $3 million closer to that $200 million shortfall that we have in the current year. To the extent that the council up until this point has preserved public safety and identified that as the top priority. For a large part of the public safety departments, such as police and fire, they have been shielded from the majority of the cuts. And as you've indicated, some departments will be taking a substantial reduction, somewhere in the range of 20 to 30 to 40%, in order to preserve your top priority. Now, to the extent that you want to balance it, we look to the elected officials of the city to make the appropriate reductions based on the balances that you provide to us. And right now, up until this point, we have shielded public safety. So to the extent that you want to actually start backing away a little bit, $15 million in savings next year means $15 million and less cuts in those other departments.
Right. But there's a choice of words are very important here. When we talk about backing away, shouldn't we be talking about how we start redefining it that it has been? And it's a dangerous path, I understand it, because no one wants to be politically unpopular when they say, well, we should have to cut back police. But at what cost? And that's what I'm going to keep pushing forward.
I think it's also interesting, too, when you look at the CAO's report with regard to the formula in terms of hiring, that in essence, if you were to look at the number of officers that are actually deployable and working in the field, that if you compare it to where we were in June of last year versus today, we actually have 300 officers more than what we had on June
I don't think
30th.
council's ever addressed that before. We've always looked at deployment as just this number that includes all the paychecks issued by the police department. But does an academy recruit provide the same marginal utility as a police officer in the field, as somebody who's been with the department for 10 years? And the answer to that is no. Until they get out of the academy and can be deployed into the field, that person does not have marginal utility for the police department.
Compare utility, but the problem is you always have a lag time of getting the person out in the street. And then the real question is the level of service, and that's the elected officials.